All right, the first question says, hi, any advice for applying as a second-year graduate student? I'm applying again, but unsure what changes in terms of expectations. Most of the examples I've seen have been for high school or first-year students. All right.
Well, one thing is that when you applied previously, you should have gotten some feedback from the committee on your application. So you definitely want to address any comments that they had with regard to your application.
I would also say that it's important to get an updated list of recommenders. And so maybe as a first year, you might have had some people from from undergrad, helping with your recommendation letters. I think it's important that you get a list of people from here at Duke, your advisor, people, researchers from class, and the like.
Okay, the feedback was almost entirely positive, just not informative or useful. It was kind of bland positive. So it didn't really specify what you were doing wrong.
Yeah, I think so. There's a student in my lab who had a similar experience where there were comments, I guess, more or less about the broader impacts that maybe it would have been better to shine that up or polish it up a bit. But overall, it seemed very positive. And so I think, at least from what I've heard, the biggest thing to work on, if you didn't receive too much negative feedback, would be to work on enhancing your broader impacts and making a stronger story across both essays that you have to write. I think that's probably the most important thing, aside from recommendations and the rest of the application, is establishing a strong story that correlates between the two essays.
I think also, since you've been in graduate school, demonstrating that you've been successful at graduate school and will continue to be a successful researcher and somebody who's involved in broader impact. So changing the tune of your, just starting out to I've already been there, done that, proved that I can be an effective researcher and get my work out there, whether hopefully you've been to conferences or are working towards a paper, perhaps, if it's not out. I think that definitely puts you in a more positive light for the reviewers.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Catherine. Our next question says, for life science, do you have any insight as to where the NSF draws the line for basic versus translational research? Go ahead, Kevin.
So my understanding, so I'm in genetics and plant genetics specifically, but my understanding is that NSF always says, this cannot be medically relevant. This cannot be something that NIH would fund. But my understanding is that that's not really the case. So I think anything that would be involved, where you're doing anything with clinical trials with patients, maybe that's sort of over the line. But I think even there's always a way to spin it as you're doing something that's going to answer basic questions about biology. So I think that line is definitely really blurry. And if you feel like you're on the more kind of NIH side of things, I think there's still hope, and that you should certainly apply.
Thank you, Kevin. Let me go back to the previous question that talked about the broader impact statement. Is this something, Joy, that you would be able to assist the students with?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really sort of the whole goal of the office that we're establishing within Science and Society. So we're going to be a resource so that people can make an appointment for sort of a one-on-one, come in and, we'll have office hours and you can sit and chat. We can not only sort of give you feedback on ideas that you have, but, we have a lot of experience doing outreach ourselves, and so we can give you examples of successful broader impact statements and projects that people have done in the past. The other thing is, as I mentioned previously, we really want to be sort of a clearinghouse to for all of the outreach and broader impacts activities that are going on campus here. And so, especially for graduate students, a lot of times the NSF feels that being too ambitious with a broader impacts proposal is not really realistic, and it makes more sense to try to tap into existing outreach programs or resources. And so we'll be able to connect students with those resources so that they can have a really concrete component of broader impacts in their proposal without having to start from scratch and do something that may be overly ambitious for a grad student.
Thank you. And everyone knows that the NSF guidelines, or the NSF deadline is next week. So if you have any questions, absolutely, this is the time to ask them. What is the name and/or contact info for who to contact regarding the broader impact?
Oh, I guess that's me.
That's you, Jory.
So again, my name is Jory Weintraub. The easiest way to get me is just through my Duke email address, which is jory@duke.edu. For the record, I have an alias that I set up. It's go.heels@duke. But jory@duke.edu is probably the easiest.
And I encourage you all to reach out to Jory. It's a good resource that Duke offers. Definitely tap into that.
Maybe, is there a way we can
Put
the
your
chat
email address.
window just so they have it?
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can I say something about broader impacts? This is just so important. As you probably know from reading it, it's equally weighted as the research proposal, which is really hard to get your head around when you're applying for these things. Give the broader impacts equal weight as your research proposal. But one thing that I did this year, and this is for anybody who might be applying next year, is there's an organization on campus called SIREN, SCIREN, and it's a student-led organization where they do lesson plan workshops for getting kind of projects that are based around your research into public schools. And they had a lesson plan writing workshop in September, and then had an event at the Natural Science Museum in Raleigh, where teachers came in and you had a lesson plan that you were presenting, that you gave out to teachers, and a sort of networking event between researchers and teachers. It was really easy to come up with a plan and to do this within this structure. And this gives a chance for teachers to come and talk to you, and you can meet with them, and maybe if you want to, go to the school or just let them do your implement your lesson plan in their in school. So I highly recommend that organization. Again, that's SIREN, SCIREN, SIREN.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. All right, we got another question coming in. As a follow-up for the broader impacts question, how related does an outreach activity need to be to our research project? Go ahead, Chris.
So it's my understanding that it's a common misconception that the broader impacts has to be about your research. It's really important that what you're selling is that you will have a broader impact on science outreach, not necessarily that your research does.
Melanie?
As a follow-up to that, I think one of the best things you can do with broader impacts is try to use that to tie your personal statement and your research proposal together in any way that you can. That's kind of the one way to make them fit and make it a full story and kind of sell yourself as the person, because NSF is looking to fund the person and not necessarily the research project that you're proposing. So that's a good place for you to use your broader impacts and try to kind of tie in any way that you can. Mine was really cheesy, and my boss loved it, and I didn't, and it ended up working out for me. So I don't think it has to necessarily be
related to the research.
I would actually argue that I hope it isn't. I think that was to my advantage because I had a lot of outreach experience. I was really involved with a lot of organizations in undergrad and community service related. And I think that that really made that part of the essay shine because it was so different. You really have a very limited landscape for which to propose and to express yourself through these essays. And I think it's important that you make the essays as orthogonal as possible to make you stand out. And so these outreach activities have nothing to do necessarily with the research per se, but establish you as someone who's willing to commit, as someone who's passionate. These things speak volumes about you, and I think that going along with that idea that they're looking to fund you and not necessarily the research exactly is huge.
Thank you, Corey.
Okay, and it's Edward.
Oh, absolutely.
So I just want to emphasize too that when people talk about broader impacts, most of the time people think of outreach, and that's what we've talked a lot about here already. But if you go to the NSF website and you actually look at how they define broader impact, there are really several different sort of categories that they all consider falling under the umbrella of broader impact. The broadening participation, so outreach, often involving outreach to minority students or people that are underrepresented in science and technology. That's sort of the main one, and I would say that's where most people choose to focus their efforts on broader impacts, but there are other categories as well. So developing science and technology infrastructure is another one. Making advancements or enhancements in teaching and training and learning is another one. So, it's important not to think too narrowly about what broader impacts really means. So I would encourage everybody to go to the NSF website. And actually, if you just Google broader impacts, I think the very first thing that comes up is a link to an NSF PDF document called BIC Examples, Broader Impacts Criterion Examples. And that'll not only outline the different categories, but give you specific examples of each. So,
thank you, George. All right. If I am very unsure if I want to pursue a career in academia, industry, or government, how should I address this in my personal statement?
From my personal experience, I remember leaving this part pretty vague in my personal statement because I was also unsure and didn't want to close any doors. So I feel like that's not necessarily a bad tone to take, but hopefully other people have better insight.
Kevin.
So my first year in school, I applied, and one of the main things that they had a problem with was you couldn't see where it was going and where it was going to end, where it was going to sort of end up. Some idea about the forward focus. So I actually think the second time, even though I'm not sure if I want to go into industry or into academia, I have no idea even at this point. I crafted kind of a narrative that was very specific, which may or may not be true. It's possible, but I felt like that was necessary because people didn't see kind of a forward thinking and a focus as to where I'm going to be at the end of this.
Thank you, Kevin. These are very good questions.
Yeah, I did a similar sort of thing, and I'd go back and forth month to month whether I want to be an academics or not. But I said that I wanted to be an academics and sort of made it a good integral part of my personal statement. And I still feel, I don't think that's unfair necessarily to if you feel passionately about something in the moment and they understand that things change. So I don't know.
I think there's another way you could approach that, which is also to say that you are unsure, but this is the next step to help you figure it out. And that still allows you either way, you're saying, I have a path forward.
All right. Sure, go ahead, Kevin.
So I would encourage, if you're within, in your program, or incoming students in your program, people that you know that are possibly applying to school, applying to graduate school, I really encourage them to apply, because the more times you do this, a couple of us have talked already about input that we got back the first time that's influenced the way that we wrote the proposal the second time. But I think that just multiple tries is really important. And so I wish I would have applied as going into my first year, applied as before I started school. I really think that just more chances that you have. There's sort of even if you in your best situation where you've covered everything. Like, I felt like my proposal this past, when I was awarded the fellowship, I felt like I had done everything that I possibly could and checked every box that they could possibly every criteria that they could possibly look at, and I still felt like I had a 50-50 chance at it at best. So just encourage anybody that you can to just apply.
How many times did you apply before you were awarded, Kevin?
So I applied my first year, and then I was awarded my second year. But I would, like to have 3 shots at it.
Has anybody else applied just once and awarded at the same time? Yeah. Chris and Melanie and Corey?
That was twice.
Twice.
I hope. I know that everyone here is motivated to apply for it, but I mean, for me, it was really a transformative scholarship, fellowship to receive, because for me, when I was coming in, I applied as an undergrad, and I was still picking schools, and actually, it's the reason why I'm here. I was actually rejected from Duke initially the day before I received the NSF. And with grad school, as I'm sure you guys all know, it's much more about how can they fund you, and so that's why so few are accepted into grad school. So once funding became a non-obstacle, a lot of the schools turned around and said that they would be able to offer me admission. And so even with that, beyond that, here, it was also the reason why I got into the lab that I'm in now. I came here under another advisor, and I was able to find what I was really passionate about. And so that transition from one lab to another was really, really easy because I had my own funding. So this has done wonders for me here at grad school, and I can encourage people more to apply, because I'm sure that it's done wonders for everyone here. I mean, this is why we're here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Corey. Another question has come in. How do you balance being specific and detailed in your research, proposals, interests, with having a broad pool of potential reviewers, some of which do very different work? For example, I'm applying in biological anthropology and do genomics work, so my application can be reviewed as autonomous. And that's okay. Thank you.
I think just like any grant, you need to establish a broader perspective for people to understand. It's just like when you're presenting. In general, for grant writing, you don't know necessarily who's going to be reviewing you. Of course, with grants, probably it's more specific. But for this one, you're right that there's probably going to be people who are looking at your essay who aren't necessarily in your field. And so I think that's actually an added bonus if you get someone who's in your field, because if you have someone in your field, they're going to be extra critical. And so you actually kind of want someone who isn't necessarily in your field, so you have the opportunity to introduce the idea as a new perspective. And so that in that way, I think it's highly beneficial, and for you, and you can actually paint that image for them, in a very positive light, what your research is going to do, and you can do it from a very broad perspective. And so I think that above all is the most important, and where you fill in the details is where, the rest of the space. But you really need to introduce it and establish it from a broad perspective.
Thank you, Corey. Jory.
And I can add something to that. Having served on review panels before, I can tell you that one of the things that the panels are looking for, and this is particularly true of the younger scientists, is an ability to clearly communicate what you're working on. Of course, the science has to be novel and it has to be interesting, it has to be well thought out. But really, the key is communicating it clearly and effectively to a broad audience. And if you can demonstrate that you have that ability, then they're going to be more interested in supporting your research, because communicating what you do effectively is going to be a key to your success all the way through your science career. So, you need to think about the different audiences. You need to write it in a way that if someone does know your field, it's going to make a lot of sense what you're trying to do. But even if they don't, they'll have a good sense of where you're coming from. And to that end, I would suggest, running drafts of your proposal past a really broad range of people, not just your advisor, not just people in your lab, but reach out to other people, possibly even in other departments, and get feedback. Because again, the key is communicating what you do effectively.
Thank you, George. Chris?
And as you're painting the outlines of that picture, that allows you to put in some references to what's already going on, which also gives you the opportunity to prove that you're already thinking like a scientist, that you're already doing lit reviews. Don't forget your citations. They count towards your space, so use the smallest version of way of citation that you can find, because they don't specify.
Yeah, to follow up on what Chris just said, I also had done a lot of reading and included a decent number of citations, but did them in the Nature format and just a running list at the bottom. So even though I think I had like 15 references or maybe even more, it took up just a couple lines of space. And I think having that in there, if I remember my reviews, sort of proved that I had done the background work and was ready to move forward. So I think that's really important and something that a lot of people forget to focus on, or not focus on, but have that as a critical element in your research statement.
Thank you, Catherine. Oh, Chris.
I would like to add one thing which doesn't necessarily apply to any of these questions, but I think it's worth pointing out. One of the people who read one of my drafts to give me some feedback has read for the NSF. And she said that it is not uncommon for them to go and look at what your current advisor researches and try and determine that you are not just rolling with wherever he or she is going next. So it's worth, even if that's not the case, making sure that it doesn't appear that's the case.
Thank you, Chris. Any more questions? All right. When writing the research statement, how specific should the proposed experiment be? Do we need a definite field site, number of participants, etc.?
It seems like the more concrete things are and the more thought you've put into them, the more proof, or it comes across that you've really put the thought into it. So while they understand that you're not going to have every little detail thought out, I think providing concrete examples of how you've thought through the process is very important and certainly wouldn't detract. And for me, I included some things in my research statement that I have changed course and I'm no longer doing, and it's not something that you need to run by them necessarily if you're not making a big jump or shift. So I think including the details on the front end, even if they might change down the road, might serve you well. I don't know if others have opinions about that.
Corey?
Yeah, that was one of the feedback, or the feedback I got from my professor, actually, the major feedback. So I was interested in doing X-ray diffraction experiments, and that's what I wrote my research proposal on. And I remember that he even told me to include the specific beamlines that I would do these experiments on. So, for instance, at Stanford, they have an X-ray diffraction beamline, and so I said that, they have the center there, but they have specific beamline offshoots where you can do specific experiments. And so I cited those very specific beamlines because this is common among people in the field. And so if I did get someone who was aware of the field, that looked very, very good. And so to have that specific concrete place that I would do those experiments was good.
I think another important thing to keep in mind is that the NSF, this is just a stipend towards you, and so just to keep in mind that the funding is not necessarily going towards your project. So if you have an expensive project, then it might be worth, I'm not sure if it would be worth acknowledging how that's going to be funded or supported. I don't know how that's not necessarily something you need to do, I guess, but just to keep that in mind as you're writing these things. And there's also no travel funds associated with this, so that's another thing to keep in mind as you go forward.
Great. And just to follow up on that, not only are they not funding your research, you're not held to this research. You're proving that you can think about a problem, identify a problem, and how you would go about solving it. But the research that I'm going to be doing has nothing to do with the research that I won the NSF with.
What was your proposed research, Chris, with the NSF?
Well, I proposed that I was going to find out how, when a droplet of water is oscillating, basically how the energy is consumed during that oscillation process. I am going to end up working with droplets, but that's about where the overcross ends. And the way that I went about it, I was an undergrad when I applied. So as part of my looking at potential advisors who I might want to work with, I found someone who was working on something that I thought was fascinating and jumped off of their recent work. But because that wasn't my current advisor, we didn't have a connection. The NSF didn't appear to have any problem with that.
Good enough. All right. More questions? Can anyone provide examples of how you made seemingly unimpressive experience sound very significant in your personal statement?
I would hope that you would focus on things that are impressive. And we all have done, if we're here, we've all done great things to get us into this institution, and I'm sure that your experiences probably speak for themselves.
I don't know about unimpressive. I think what's a better question, if I could rephrase it, would be tangential almost. So experiences that may not necessarily, like we talked about before, that aren't necessarily related to the research you're doing, but are, I think, important to establishing who you are as a person. I think that's really important. And again, it always comes down to how you market it. And so how do you put this forward in a way that says that this is going toward my broader impact? So I was involved with an organization for community service, Circle K, which is part of Kiwanis, and that really has nothing to do with my research. But the storyline that I established in these essays that I had to write, which at the time I think we had 3 at the time. The story that I established was that I wanted to serve the greater community of science. And so I wanted to establish myself as someone who was willing to do that service. And so that's why I integrated all of that into a key component of the story that I was trying to tell. And so I think that's really much more important, is that, even if you think it's tangential, or it could even be, as you said, unimpressive to that community, I think you can establish it or market it in a way that could be relevant to the essay.
Melanie?
Just kind of to piggyback off of what Corey was saying, you really want to use your personal statement to get across your entire character. So, for example, I was a student athlete all through undergrad, and that has absolutely nothing to do with the science that I do. But it was something that was very important to character building and kind of becoming the scientist that I am today, just with time management and different things. So being able to sell it and so how that experience had kind of affected me coming into the sciences, and being a scientist was really important to me to be in there. And whether the reviewers thought it was impressive or not, I don't really know. But I knew it was something that I wanted in there and wanted to get across. So I just kind of tried to work my personal statement around that. And I mean, it didn't show up as much in my research statement, maybe a little bit in the broader impacts, but I really used that as kind of something to get across who I was as a person, aside from just being a scientist. And that's kind of, I feel like, what Corey was saying as well.
Thanks, Melanie. Kevin?
I think one way that I was just thinking about this while we were talking. I think one way to think about this is you came in with a group of students with your incoming class, and you're different from those students. So if you could think about how are you different from the rest of your classmates, and what makes you unique, what makes your perspective unique, because really that's sort of in miniature what you're going to be kind of competing against to get the fellowship. Is you're going to have a bunch of really qualified people, and you have to figure out how are you going to get to the top of the pile and make yourself stand out amongst these really kind of seemingly equally qualified group of people. So if you can think about that, I'm sure there are plenty of ways in which you're unique among your incoming classmates, amongst your class.
Kevin? I heard that the NSF loves interdisciplinary. Is it possible to overemphasize this?
I don't think so. I think that that's an incredibly, not admirable, but sought out quality in terms of the research, that it's interdisciplinary. I mean, the research today is I don't know that you can find a pure subject that's being researched. Everything is so interdisciplinary. And so the more interdisciplinary it is, I think the more applicable it is to today's world. I mean, there's really very few things that are so pure, like I said. But yeah, I think it's important to overemphasize it, and I think that would help in the probability of resonating with your reviewer.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, just definitely make sure you are pretty well defined in both disciplines, and make sure that it's very clear, but I don't think there's a way to overemphasize it.
Jory?
I was just going to add that the NSF does love interdisciplinarity, but what they don't love is being overly ambitious or unrealistically ambitious. So I think you do need to find that you sort of have to walk that tightrope between emphasizing the interdisciplinary nature of what you're doing without seeming like you're biting off more than you can chew, or that you're over-promising. And that's, I think, particularly common in proposals from younger scientists. They're looking for that. So they want you to show a realistic understanding of what's reasonable and capable for you to do, given the limited time frame of the funding period that you're asking for support to do.
Thank you, George. All right, keep bringing those questions in. Deadline is approaching. Oh, Kevin, I'm sorry.
There was one thing that this goes along with reading the program announcement, reading the announcement for submissions or whatever it's called, and kind of keying in on exactly what they're finding clues in there as to what they're looking for. There was something in there about some international component. So I took a little bit of space, just a couple of sentences, saying how this is GROW program, which is money for international travel and exchange. And so I took a couple sentences to kind of give an example, give an idea of what I would possibly do with the GROW funding if I was funded. some international collaborations that I could possibly do. So everything's really tight. There's so little room to express anything in these proposals that I feel like that was necessary because there was specifically something in the announcement about international collaborations.
And to elaborate more on the GROW, that is the graduate research opportunities worldwide when you travel abroad to work on your dissertation. The NSF is a separate award from the NSF, which we allow our students to reserve after they've utilized all their years to be able to travel and get funding for that traveling. They will pay $5,000 for you to travel to these locations, and at some times you might be able to receive a stipend at the same time from your host institution and also from Duke. So that is something definitely to keep in mind if you're looking at international travel for dissertation research. All right, any more questions? We'll wait about another minute if anyone's got anything else to ask or concern.
So I'm just going to comment on something that kind of stressed me out when I was applying that we haven't really touched on here, and that was who to get to write recommendations for you. So in my program, we don't affiliate with a lab until spring semester. So when I was preparing my NSF my first year, I didn't have a research advisor at that point. And so I had somebody in my department that definitely helped me with my proposal, but I felt like I would have stronger recommendation letters from 3 professors at my undergraduate institution, which is what I went with. And it worked out for me, but I definitely, looking back, kind of wish that I would have picked somebody from Duke to write a recommendation for me, even though they may not know you as well quite yet. I think that knowing that you've established those connections early at this new institution is probably pretty important.
Thank you, Melanie.
To follow up on that, if you were recent or have recently come to Duke, then your advisor, if you have one, may have or probably read your rec letters from undergrad. So my advisor here at Duke was able to tell me which of my undergrad advisors wrote more compelling recommendation letters. So it's not out of the realm of possibility to speak with people as to if you have 2 people who you have worked with equally, just ask around and see who's giving you stronger letters. There's nothing wrong with that.
Thank you, Catherine. Another question has come in. What do you think was the strongest piece of your application and why? Chris?
So I'm a non-traditional student, and I felt like my personal essay was the strongest part because I was able to talk about how I wasn't the average student. And I don't think you have to be a non-traditional student to not be the average student. I mean, most people are not the average student in some way or another. But I thought that was a really nice place for me to flesh out that I'm a real person and that I'm bringing a lot more than just a good academic record to this proposal.
Thank you. Go ahead, Catherine.
I think that just my research experience I'd done a lot of research in undergrad and sort of tried to hit the ground running at Duke, and I applied twice. The first time got an honorable mention and then got it my second year, and really focusing in on, the fact that I'd gone to lots of conferences and had a first author paper and had done a lot of field work and things like that. When I read the reviews, it was very obvious that people were impressed by the research. So if you can elaborate on how much research you've done or and sort of prove that you are a good and capable researcher and will continue to be down the road, I think that is really fundamentally the very most important thing. And then things like broader impacts in your personal statement are very important too. But at the very least, you need to prove that you're a good researcher to be able to get this fellowship. So,
Thank you. Melanie?
I would say for me, it was probably that I had been involved and been successful in multiple different areas. I mean, as I said earlier, I was a student athlete, so being able to tie that in and also being a successful researcher. So I presented research at conferences. I had a paper that was in preparation when I was applying, and I think it was probably submitted right before I submitted my NSF. So I definitely think trying to prove that all the facets kind of go together and make you into a stronger candidate.
Thank you. Corey?
I probably said this already, but I think the strongest part of my application was the story that I established. I even did so to talk about the issue that we discussed before, Melanie, the recommendations. So when I asked the people who wrote my recommendations to write me one, I was very specific in what I wanted them to mention. And so, if we've had some sort of experience together that I felt was worthwhile discussing, obviously with the research professor with research, the classroom experiences, projects, things like that you've had the opportunity to engage further, I made sure to let them know that these are the kind of things I wanted them to put into the recommendation letter to mention, if not focus on, because I was going to contribute to the overall story. And so I think that having that integrity in your application with that storyline is really what put my application forward.
Thank you, Corey. Melanie, you mentioned that you got your recommendations from undergrad. And that, as a first-year student, you recommend that if they don't have an advisor?
I think it really depends. I also benefited from the fact that I went to a very small undergraduate institution, and I had very close faculty relationships with the chemistry department while I was there. So I knew that I would have no trouble getting good recommendation letters from them, and all of the people that I asked had already written recommendation letters for me for previous things. But I think that if you've established a connection with a new faculty member at Duke, even if it's just like a brief or somebody whose lab you think you're going to join, even if you don't necessarily end up there, if you've had them for class or something, I definitely think that that could be very beneficial.
And Catherine, let me ask you, you stated that you were honorable mention the first time around, and they critiqued your application. What things did you have to change?
All I really needed to change was my broader impacts. If I remember correctly, the first time around, I just didn't give concrete enough examples. And like what Jory was saying, I was talking about things that I was going to sort of do on my own and weren't pre-existing programs. And then the second time around, I worked with my advisor to get concrete examples of things that already exist and things that were very attainable. And so, yeah, before everything was fine except for, I think, it's even if you get excellent reviews, you can still not get it. So the very first time around, it was still the only criticism, like I said, was the broader impacts. And so just tweaking that made it go through, essentially. So coming up with those more concrete and sort of attainable things is what made the difference.
What about you, Kevin? On your first try at the NSF, what type of things did they pick out of your application that these students might pay more attention to?
So I think I mentioned this before, but they didn't see where I planned to go, where I would be at the end of this, where I was going. So I had to really kind of create a really strong narrative about where I was going to end up at the end of this, or where I think I was going to end up at the end of this. because it kind of seemed wishy-washy. I talked about, oh, I'm going to get these skills, I'm going to learn this, I'm going to learn that, but I never said what's going to be the culmination of all this work. So I tried to do that. And the other thing was just really change directions in my broader impacts. I came up with a very concrete project that I was going to do in connections with specific people, specific teachers. So that's what really changed. But I don't know. A lot of this is a lot of it just depends on whose hands, whose pile it ends up in, and what they think is. We're giving a lot of, I think, a lot of really good advice, and there's just this element to it where it's just who's going to pick it up, and what are they going to think is important. So I tried to just give them no reason give them no excuse to kind of say to put an X mark on any of the parts. So.
Good advice. Be confident in your application. Okay, we have a few more minutes. So please ask your questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
With regard to letters of reference, they don't all have to be academic or research. Also, if you've done an internship, if you've been particularly involved in some community activities, I think those are worthwhile ways of rounding out that picture of who you are and the fact that you have a good work ethic and that you're involved.
Or if analysts like to add anything that they can think of on the application, think back on your application when you submitted it. What were your things that you said, I wish I would have done this or had done that? But, yeah.
We already mentioned this, but just to make it very clear, I think it is very important to have lots of different people read your application. I made my parents read them, I made my husband read it. I made not necessarily people who are even in science. And you never know what one person might find to help clarify your statement. And like we already talked about, or we talked about before, that you never know who's going to be reading your application. And it could be somebody who knows a lot about what you're doing, or it could be somebody who knows nothing, depending on what sort of category you're in. So I think it's just it doesn't hurt to have lots of people read your application. You never know where that last little bit of polish might come from.
Great, thank you. And please remember that Jory is here as a resource.
Yes, that is true. Happy to help.
Yes. Any questions, please, about your impact statements? See Jory.
I guess maybe one thing I'd add to that is historically one of the problems that a lot of people, and this is not just younger scientists, but at all levels, have something they've struggled with in terms of broader impacts is that they will get a proposal, say a 3-year funded proposal, and you get so consumed with the science that a lot of times people sort of put off working on the broader impacts until the very end of the project, and then realize, especially if they don't have a lot of experience doing outreach or whatever the broader impact component is, that it sometimes takes a while for these projects to come together. It doesn't happen overnight. And so I think it's important to communicate in your proposal that if you're getting 3 years of funding, that your broader impact plan is something that you don't intend to wait till 3 months before the funding period ends to start working on the outreach piece of it, but that you have a plan for how you're going to implement it, side by side with the research component, so that you can achieve both goals, the research goals and the broader impact goals.
Thank you. All right, we have about another minute, and then we're going to wrap this up. So feel free to put your questions in chat, and if we haven't addressed something that you would like to send to me, you can do that also. Go through grad-finade@duke.edu, and I will make sure that your questions or concerns are addressed. And I'm very hopeful that we'll see more awardees next year. Yes, ma'am.
Did any of you take time between undergraduate and graduate school?
I didn't, but I took time before finishing my undergrad.
How did you address that in your application? Did you do something science related during that time? Or no?
Actually, I graduated high school in '95, so it's been a big chunk of time. And I talked about why I did not, in the first paragraph of my personal essay, I kind of neat bow short version why I didn't go to school right out of high school. And then over the course of 3 or 4 paragraphs I wrapped my professional and educational experience together and basically painted a story about how I was moving closer and closer to becoming a scientist. And in retrospect, you can kind of lay that path. You can see how you got here, even if at the time you didn't know you were headed here. If that makes sense. And I think that helps my application. You know, I haven't done undergraduate research every summer in a way that many people have by the time they get into grad school. You know what I mean? But I think that outweighs that.
All right. I want to thank Melanie, Catherine, Jory, Evan, Corey, and Chris for helping us with this webinar today. And like I said, in the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email, and we will address your questions as quickly as we can. I'd like to thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.